Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 13. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome all new patrons as well as existing patrons. I know some people had emailed me and some people sent me messages via Twitter asking when I would comment on the Nigerian situation, the ongoing campaign, End SARS hashtag. And I did make a brief commentary. It's on my YouTube channel, and I also posted it on Twitter. I tweeted it. I will also do a special episode shortly focusing on the Nigerian situation. So today's focus is on African nationalism and independence. There were two primary routes to independence in African countries: negotiated with the colonial powers, and then the armed struggle. The countries that had to pick up arms to fight for their independence were the countries that had sizable European settlement populations. And I use the term settlement very hesitantly, as I explained in a previous podcast. I don't think it's right to refer to people who came and ejected people from land that was settled, where Africans lived, committed ethnic cleansing, in many instances involving massacres, and then to refer to these usurpers as settlers. But for lack of a better term, let's use the term settler. So you find that armed resistance had to be conducted in Algeria, for example, that had a sizable European population from France. They had to fight a war of independence. In Kenya, there was a substantial European settlement population. The Europeans that ejected Kenyans, primarily Kikuyus, from some of the most fertile lands in the country and seized 4 million acres, which, as I discussed in the last podcast, sold at a penny an acre to 1,000 Europeans. So in Kenya, there was also armed resistance. And in all of the Portuguese colonies in Africa, Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau, they also had to fight a war of national liberation. And in the case of the Portuguese colonies, it was waged from the early 1960s all the way until 1974, when during that period, most African countries won their independence in the 1960s. And then, of course, the last country to win its independence was South Africa, when Nelson Mandela was released in 1990 after 27 years of incarceration. And his party, the African National Congress, won the first elections in South Africa where every ethnicity, every race was allowed to participate. The franchise was open for the first time to non-Europeans as well. All right, so let's focus first on Ghana, because Ghana was the first British colony south of the Sahara that won its independence. But I want to put it in a broader context first. A number of events had paved the way toward African nationalism and independence. And one of the most important ones was the fascist Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1936 under dictator Mussolini. It was a violent invasion with the use of chemical weapons, the use of mustard gas. And that is how the brave Ethiopian army was ultimately defeated. Ethiopia was the only African country that had never been colonized. So Ethiopia stood as a great symbol of pride to Africans throughout the continent and to Africans in the diaspora. In fact, as I discussed in an earlier episode, after Ethiopia was invaded by Italy, Africans in diaspora, including African Americans here in the United States, were signing up to volunteer to go and fight on behalf of Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian catastrophe, its invasion by Italy, evoked a sense of nationalism that had not existed in other parts of Africa. By that time, heading toward World War II, many Africans had moved in the urban areas, some to work in the European-controlled mining companies, and some to work as domestics in European homes, and some to work in low-level clerical positions as the European administration was being set up throughout African countries. So these were the people who had access to information and became aware of what was happening in Ethiopia. And these were the folks that later on mobilized and formed the first sort of generation of African political leadership as their consciousness became elevated. And then after World War II, when Africans in their hundreds of thousands were drafted to go and fight in Europe, in the Far East, on behalf of empire, to protect empire and democracy, when they returned, the ones who were fortunate to return, because many of them died, of course, on the front lines, the ones who returned were no longer willing to live as fifth-class citizens in their own countries. Because after all, in 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt had issued the Atlantic Charter. That's in 1941, in August, a statement outlining the United States and Britain's plans for a post-World War II leadership and how they saw the world evolving after the Second World War. And one of the key items in the Atlantic Charter was that people would have the right to self-determination. But obviously, this did not mean much to Britain, which had colonization embedded very deeply in its DNA. So it was meaningless to Britain. Britain did not start paving the way towards self-determination in its African colonies. So Africans had to start agitating, and in the countries with sizable European populations, they had to actually pick up arms and fight for their liberation. So in Ghana, which was considered to be the jewel of Britain's empire in Africa, apart from South Africa, in 1948, war veterans, Ghanaians, at that time, of course, it was still the Gold Coast, who had fought on behalf of empire during World War II and had seen none of the promises delivered, drew up a petition to deliver to the castle where the governor lived, the European governor in Ghana. Before they reached the castle, they were confronted by armed police. And then a European commander seized a firearm from one of the African police officers and started firing into the demonstrators, killing several and wounding several. And of course, it erupted in multiple protests, and that was the beginning, really, of the end of British colonial rule in Ghana. And it also marked the emergence of Kwame Nkrumah as a leader. So he had set up his own political party, the Convention People's Party, the CPP, and Nkrumah was arrested and he was blamed for the uprising that erupted after that massacre of the petitioners who were simply wanting to deliver a petition to the governor. Nkrumah was locked up, but he had sizable support, and Britain was able to see this and realize that colonial rule in Ghana was coming to an end. Britain allowed elections to be held for internal self-administration, and even though Nkrumah was behind bars, his party won the majority of seats, and he had to be released to form an internal self-government, but was not yet in charge of its foreign policy. That did not come until 1957, when Ghana ultimately won its formal independence from Britain. In contrast to Ghana, in Kenya, Africans had to take up arms. The Europeans were not willing to let go of the 4 million acres of the very fertile land that had been renamed the White Highlands, to rub it in further into the former owners, the African owners. The entire region had been renamed the Kenya White Highlands, reserved for European ownership. So, in the early 1950s, the Kenyans formed a guerrilla army called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. It was widely demonized and derided in the Western media. Of course, because if people knew what they were actually fighting for, it would be very difficult for Britain to continue to oppose independence in Kenya. So I want to read some of the kind of references that they were subjected to in Western media. The American press just basically echoed the propaganda of British media, particularly publications like Time magazine, which was published by Henry Luce. Henry Luce, an American whose father had been missionaries in China, and they'd been supporters of Chiang Kai-shek, who was, of course, defeated by Mao Zedong's Red Army in 1949. So in Kenya, Luce was essentially carrying out the war that Chiang Kai-shek had lost in China. So as far as he was concerned in Kenya, it was a battle between Reds, as he characterized it, and Africans who were inspired by witchcraft and communism. A very interesting combination, witchcraft and communism. So let me read some of the items from Time magazine. Here's an article from September 1, 1952. It was under the abusive headline, Black and Red Magic. The black, of course, referring to Africans, and the red referring to alleged communism influence. Quote, in recent years, the black 97% of Kenya's population has banded together in a dozen fanatic anti-white secret societies run by witch doctors and pledged to the slogan, Africa for Africans. Okay, so the part Africa for Africans, of course, it was correct. They wanted their land back. But then the propaganda part is the anti-white secret society. Guerrilla armies are by nature secret. They fight in terrain where conventional armies cannot penetrate. So in that sense, yes. But the reference here was to give it that ominous, very frightening persona to the liberation fighters. So let me read another item. This is from November 3, 1952, under the headline, "The Meow Meows." Very despicable headline. And this is also from Time magazine. And this is one part that I would read for you here. Quote, "Part land hunger, part savage revolution against the domineering white man and the bewildering 20th century. The Mau Mau's blind fury could, if left unchecked, turn the crown colony of Kenya into another Malaya," end quote. And this is, of course, reference to what is now Malaysia, which at that time was also fighting against British colonialism, and it had an ongoing insurgency as well. All right, now let me read finally the New York Times coverage of the same war of liberation in Kenya. This is an item from December 7, 1952. Quote, "Over the equatorial landscape of Kenya, the British Crown colony in East Africa, lies the frightening shadow of Mau Mau, a secret tribal society whose campaign of murder has forced the imposition of martial law." So the so-called terrorists and their frightening shadow and their campaign of murder is why Kenya had to impose, the colonial government, a state of emergency. Not because the Kenyans were fighting a just cause to regain their land back, to end their virtual enslavement, having to work for Europeans on land that belonged to them rightfully. And then here's another part here. Quote, "The first aim of the Mau Mau, with its voodoo apparatus of disemboweled animals for warnings and long machete-like knives for their killings, seems to drive the 36,000 whites out of Kenya." Completely incorrect. Their mission, their objective was to regain their land. And of course, after Kenya became independent, many Europeans continued to live in Kenya. And in fact, part of the problem today in Kenya is that the land issue was never really resolved. And we'll discuss some of this when we get to the next episode, which will focus on neo-colonialism in Africa. Because you find that in most of these African countries, the folks who were relatively more educated and at the end sat at the bargaining table with the Europeans to formally end colonial rule, they became part of the leadership. But then there was the whole issue of the class segmentation, because essentially in most of these countries, this new leadership then became the neo-colonial administrators in Africa, essentially administrating Africa on behalf of Western capital. But that's an issue that we'll focus more on in episode number 14. And in Kenya, the British repression was very brutal. Thousands of Africans were incarcerated in concentration camps, where many of them died. Many were summarily executed by hanging. Up to 10,000, and that might be an underestimate, Kenyans died during the Mau Mau period, the so-called Mau Mau period, as they were demonized by the British, when in fact only 50 Europeans died during this resistance. So when you hear the term Mau Mau, even today in the 21st century, you should realize that this is a word whose origin is not even known. In Kenya, it's not a known word. They had a specific name for themselves: Kenya Land and Freedom Army. So they knew what they were fighting for and fighting about. But the so-called Mau Mau designation was created essentially by European public relations experts who really knew how to demonize Africans and to delegitimize the legitimate struggle in Kenya. Of course, the leader of the Kenyan Resistance, one of the most prominent ones, was eventually captured. His name is Dedan Kimathi, Kimathi, and summarily executed by the British. If you put his name on YouTube, you will see how he was paraded on a stretcher after he'd been wounded and captured, with all these Europeans jeering in the background, and a European officer sort of standing over him, and dozens of photographers taking his photograph. But he looked defiant to the very end, because he knew he was fighting a legitimate cause. And then, of course, Jomo Kenyatta, who had denied having any association with the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, ultimately became the first prime minister when Kenya won its independence from Britain, and set up the sort of neo-colonial administration that had become very typical in many African countries. Another African country that also had to fight for its independence was Algeria, where the FNL fought against the might of France. At one time, the French deployed almost 1 million soldiers in Algeria, laid mines surrounding the country so that Algerian fighters could not get assistance from neighboring countries, up to about 1 million landmines. But ultimately, in the end, they too were defeated, and Algeria ultimately won its independence in 1962, led by the FNL. And Algeria also is interesting because of its connection with South Africa. South Africa, we will have a special episode focused on South Africa, but there's one aspect that I would like to touch on South Africa. In South Africa, of course, the struggle against apartheid, which was essentially European colonialism in South Africa, was led by the ANC, the African National Congress, one of the oldest parties in Africa, founded in 1912, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, which is not as well known, but I think whose history is really not been given its just dues in the history of liberation of South Africa. And it was led by Robert Sobukwe. And the ANC, of course, the most prominent leaders were Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Winnie Mandela, who bore much of the torch when Nelson Mandela, was incarcerated after the Rivonia trials in South Africa. So I wanted to bring the Algerian connection because the African National Congress had adopted a nonviolent approach to fighting against apartheid in South Africa until it was banned in 1960. It was banned in 1960 in April after the Sharpeville massacres, when an estimated 69 people, possibly more, and 69 killed and hundreds wounded, young people mostly, when young people had protested against having to carry the pass laws. There was something called the pass laws. They were mandated to always carry with them sort of an internal passport, and they were subjected to stop and frisk. Hundreds of thousands of Black people were subjected to stop and frisk every year, and those found without their passes were either incarcerated for weeks, forced to pay a fine, or forced into hard labor, working in government-owned farms for not carrying their internal passports. So during this peaceful protest, the police opened fire on all these young people. And one of the organizers of that march was also the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, under Robert Sobukwe, who had been a university lecturer at the time. And of course, he was arrested as well. His party was also banned, as was the ANC. So after the ANC was banned by the state, the ANC at that point decided to adopt armed resistance as part of its arsenal against the apartheid regime. So in 1961, traveling on an Ethiopian passport, Nelson Mandela traveled to Algeria. And that was even before Algeria was formally independent from France, because that did not come till 1962. So Mandela trained together with the FNL guerrilla fighters. They taught him in guerrilla tactics, sabotage, how to make bombs, and how to operate weapons. And he returned to South Africa, and indeed, the ANC started carrying out sabotage campaigns against government installations. The ANC had created what was called the Umkhonto weSizwe, which means Spear of the Nation, which was its armed part of the party. The armed unit was called Spear of the Nation, and they started conducting guerrilla operations. And how was Mandela ultimately captured? He was captured when the United States Central Intelligence Agency provided a tip to the South African authorities. Said, you know that bearded fellow there? You ought to take a closer look at him. And that's how Mandela was ultimately captured, and he was tried at the Rivonia trial of 1963, 1964. And ultimately, he was convicted. And it is widely believed that it was because of the speech he made in his self-defense that is the reason why he was spared the death penalty. And that speech is available on YouTube. Mandela's speech at the Rivonia trial, Rivonia, and I highly recommend it. I'd like to read a little bit from that speech. I want to read first the part that is relatively much more well known and widely cited. But then I want to read another part that is rarely referred to, and you'll understand why it's not widely discussed after I read it. But let me read the first part, which is how he actually concluded his defense. And the speech, you could say it was almost like his version of Castro's history will absolve me, when Castro was initially captured by Batista's forces and put on trial. And he made that speech, and that speech may have also saved his life when they heard Castro so eloquent and decided this was a person who was probably not worth killing and could become a positive asset to the country. And Castro was eventually pardoned, released, went into exile, and came back on his own terms, and the rest is history in Cuba. But let's go to Mandela now. Let me read that part first that is more widely known. During my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I've fought against white domination, and I've fought against black domination. I've cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It's an idea which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. So that part has been widely cited and is well known. And there's always that version of Mandela that corporate image makers and media like focusing on. Just like there's that version of Dr. King that corporate media image setters also like to focus on. The I have a dream and let's hold hands focus, disregarding Dr. King's speech, the Riverside Church speech, for example, where he's clearly conducting a critique of capital and imperialism. And for people not familiar with that Dr. King speech, of course, I strongly urge you to go on YouTube and listen to it, the Riverside Church speech of Dr. King. So that was the corporate Dr. King, and we are more familiar now with the corporate Mandela. But let me read you another part from that same Rivonia trial speech that Mandela made. Today, I'm attracted by the idea of a classless society, an attraction which springs in part from Marxist reading and in part from my admiration of the structure and organization of early African societies in this country. The land, then the main means of production, belonged to the tribe. I hate that word for obvious reasons, because of how it's been distorted. Its meaning used to demonize Africans. But when Africans use it, obviously they don't mean it to demonize Africa. But I just had to interrupt and make that clear. Let me continue now. There were no rich or poor, and there was no exploitation. It is true, as I've already stated, that I've been influenced by Marxist thought. But this is also true of many of the leaders of the new independent states, such widely different persons as Gandhi, Nehru, Nkrumah, and Nasser. All acknowledge this act. We all accept the need for some form of socialism to enable our people to catch up with the advanced countries of this world and to overcome their legacy of extreme poverty. But this does not mean we are Marxists. Indeed, for my own part, I believe that it is open to debate whether the Communist Party has any specific role to play at this particular stage of our political struggle. The basic task at the present moment is the removal of race discrimination and the attainment of democratic rights on the basis of the Freedom Charter. Insofar as that party furthers this task, I'll welcome its assistance. I realize that it is one of the means by which people of all races can be drawn into